Murder? Mayhem? Mormons? Why not? You know me and my favorite subject, but let's make it a little dicier. Literally. I found another Exmo, and we are together collaborating to make Bloody Tales just for you. Blood Atonement, a new series from Unfiltered Rise and Hellfire Agency, where we take you down that murderous path. You're not going to want to miss it. We'll see you there.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Johnny, it takes you 5.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Unfiltered Rise with me, Heidi Love. And today I have a guest that I am just thrilled to have with me, Gary Wayne. You are one of the people that I listen to constantly. I appreciate you, your wealth of knowledge. Your books are amazing, and I'd love to hear all about that and where they can find them.
Yeah, so thank you for inviting me to your podcast, and very much looking forward to the show today. And for people who aren't aware of me, I describe myself as a Christian contrarian. And if biblically, you probably could do a comparative to a biblical Berean. So just as the Bereans verified everything Paul was saying through the scriptures, I try and measure everything that I research within the scripture, and everything within the scripture that stays within, doesn't cause contradiction. Everything's sort of got a fit, so you don't leave out the inconvenient passages, and you have to wrestle with all of the knowledge that's in the Bible. But that's my approach. So, and I've written 2 books. One is the Genesis 6 Conspiracy Part 1, and I have a generous excerpt of all 98 chapters on the website, and it is a book that I thought I would never do a sequel to, and I started writing another book, and I'm actually back at it now because I struggled for 3 years with the book, and I said I didn't want to do a sequel to Gen 6. So in the meantime, I was getting a lot of contact from the audience. I was receiving a lot of social media, Facebook, you name it, getting a lot of questions, sending information out, and I never realized the angst that was out there amongst the Christian community about the churches, what they teach and what they don't teach. And so it's one thing to focus on what they teach, but I like to focus on what they don't teach. And what they don't teach, which is most of the Bible and all of the context for what they do teach, is prehistory and prophecy. And so after listening to the Christians, they were saying that, and I'm a Christian, but Christians as a whole, they were saying, we want a book written for us. We want a book that goes deeper into the Bible than anybody else ever has, that tells us all about prehistory for the most part. And we want it done in a way that is not going to be sort of talking too much about what the polytheists sort of talk about. And book 1 is, I bring everything back to the Bible. I measure everything against the Bible, but I let the spurious forces speak for themselves. But this is something that Christians are struggling with because they get so many challenges within the church that if you ask questions about prehistory or prophecy, you might be asked to leave the church because they don't want to deal with it. And they don't provide the context, and they don't provide the raison d'etre as to why we're here, or our state of being and why we were created. And so great values but no context, and it doesn't really tell us a whole bunch of where we're going and how we're going to get there. And that's really important if indeed we're in the fig tree generation, like I think. So I finally listened and so I decided I would write a sequel, but specifically for Christians, and to go deeper in on things like the angelic hierarchy, both fallen and loyal, things like Mount Hermon, things like giants, hybrid giants, the wars of the giants that Israel fought against the giants and the hybrid giants, right from Genesis, and also including an update from book 1 on Genesis 14 as it connects into everything that I'm talking about in the first part of the book. And so all of the campaigns, and I break it down, all of the campaigns, including the ones that come after the conquest of the covenant land, which is the wars in the book of Judges. And I identify how we know we're dealing with giant kings and hybrids and humans that are following them in those wars and the judges, and all the way through King David, King Saul, and right through to King Solomon, and track a lot of the different sort of dynasties and things like that are established in there. And while I'm doing it, I'm doing references to end time prophecy on important words that you need to understand for end time prophecy to get the full context. And then I transition into end time prophecy, and I demonstrate my approach to prophecy, which is kind of different than other eschatology that's out there. And I identify my approach in the preface so that people can understand how I get where I'm going, and they can either accept that or not, but they'll understand how I get there. And I lay down an end time chronology that is, in my opinion, and it's not the complete one, but you get the bigger picture. There'll be other books because it's such a big topic. I hate to say that, but this, as it relates to this topic, I still give you a very good end time chronology without conflict.
Right. And I love how you do that. Yeah.
Passages. Yeah.
Yeah, I love how you bring it with what I call receipts, right? Because it's so easy just to throw whatever out there, or a speech or a sermon. That's a different thing. But when you bring it back to the Bible and you give this page, like, here you go, I mean, that makes sense.
And what happens through this whole process is people learn more about what's in the Bible that they're not taught about. And hopefully it'll give them a perspective to dig a little bit deeper and not to just rely on the standard preconceived conclusions to eschatology. And it's not like my approach is complicated. It's so simple. But you can't leave out inconvenient passages. That's a red flag. And the other, you know, and there's kind of 10 guidelines that I use to try and discipline myself. And that none of those passages in the Bible, when it's talking about a specific prophecy narrative or linking in with other prophecy narratives, there can't be any conflicts. And so the only way you can get there is just to do what's so simple, is to put everything around what Jesus said and not vice versa. So don't define what Jesus said by what the other prophets said, because they're just speaking what was provided to them from the Word of God, who provided us the template in Matthew 24. And then I put Luke 17 and 21 and Mark 13's additional details onto that. And then I can funnel all of the other passages into that template, and all the contradictions go away. And, you know, a lot of people say, but you can't put Revelation around that. Well, of course you can. And it has to fit, because it has to be perfect. And right in the opening of Revelation 1:1-3, we're told it's the testimony of Jesus Christ that the angel is going to present to John in a vision. If that's the testimony of Jesus, it has to fit perfectly with this chronology that he's laid down in Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 17 and 21. Of course it does. And it's you know, it's a big show to even cover off how Revelation is laid out, but it is quite simple when you just sort of break it down from the churches into Revelation 6 in the last 7 years, and that you understand that at the midpoint of Revelation 14 is the midpoint of the last 7 years, and then you get a summary, then you get the details of those major summaries that are listed in exact chronological order in Revelation 14, after the first fruits are martyred and in heaven. And it fits perfectly with Matthew 24. So you just sort of put it on there. And sort of the icing on the cake in Revelation 14 is, before you get the summary, you have the angel preaching the last of the gospel. So it's perfect, because that all happens before the abomination in Matthew 24, which Jesus guides us towards the books of Daniel to understand this last 7 years that were set aside for all prophecy and vision to be fulfilled in the coming of righteousness and the Messiah in his second return. So it's all
Isn't
there.
it amazing? Isn't it amazing what you can do when you stop the meddling of man? And you take Jesus and you just go with Jesus.
Yeah,
Awesome.
just put everything around what he says, and it's gonna work, whether it's prophecy or doctrine or anything. And so that's the approach I try and show. In book 3, I'll show more of that with different aspects, and there'll probably be more, because there's just so much to tell on end time prophecy. But it starts there. If you can just start there, you don't have to worry about all the other sort of points of view, consider them. And I always tell people, because they say, what's my position on rapture? And I do have a position on it, but my approach is simply this: is I pray for pre-trib, I prepare for mid-trib.
Right, right, because we can't just rely on something, one
Yeah,
part. That goes
yeah,
back to one part again. We have to take the whole, and
yeah.
I think you do that.
So book two is about to be released. It's got an official March
Yay.
12th date. It went to the printers in October. It got into the printing queue in December. I was initially told I might have it by late December or early January, and the updates just kept coming. And then I was told it was going to ship a week and a half ago. I still don't have any confirmation of the book shipping. I know Amazon put out an ad out there on the weekend for the release of book two and did a promotion on it for the upcoming, and you can pre-order off of Amazon and other online
Amazing.
bookstores as well. So I'm sent another email today to see whether it's shipped, but it's imminent,
It's
and
coming.
it's coming. And if people want to have a look at what's in book two, you can go to the website, genesis6conspiracy.com, Genesis 6, the number 6, generous excerpt of all 84 chapters. So a little bit smaller this time, as opposed to the 98 of book two. It's the only thing I promised. Book two was going to be smaller, and it would be targeted at Christians,
Right.
specifically targeted to provide them the things that they need to know, to answer all of the pushback from within the church, or at least most of it. And so if you wanted to get a signed copy, you can get book one or book two on pre-order at this point. And you just go to buy now, book one or book two, and go to buy from the author. And there's a international page if you're overseas, because I want to make sure people around the book have access to the book. There's a Canadian page and there's a US page. So wherever you fit in that geography. And you can also link over to Amazon.com from the Buy Now page, to BarnesandNoble.com, Amazon.ca, and over to the Kindle version for both. So that's the easiest, fastest way to get a hold of the book. Either way you buy it, it's all fine by me. I do enjoy doing the signed copies because I appreciate people
Yeah.
who are going to actually order it and wanting it signed from me. And that if you think that you're getting the whole book in the generous excerpts, if you've not read book one, be aware that's a small drop of the bucket as to what's in
Yes.
that large bucket. And people who have read book one, they know there is no loose paragraphs or sentences. It's information all the way through, and it doesn't stop coming until the last chapter.
Well, and what a gift that you have done that, even though it's a big volume, and I get that, but you're covering all the bases, and that
Yeah.
is something that's so important, I
Well, yeah.
think.
And what I do is I, I did a similar model to book one where I write it each chapter as a mini story.
Okay.
And they're 4 to 6 pages long, so you can read a chapter a night, and you can't speed read my book because there's too much information. So I used to joke I should put a warning on the book cover that if you speed read it, you're going to pop some brain cells. So uh, digest it,
Watch out, people.
yeah,
You've been
digest
warned.
it as you can. But because it's written in that way, and that information will come up again and again as it's relevant throughout the book, is you can pick a chapter and read it out of order, or you can read
Okay.
it at your own pace. And so another thing I like to say, whether it's book one or book two, just if you just summarize the table of contents, it's going to get your interest up. So, and I cover off topics and names in my table of contents in book two that I'll guarantee most Christians have never heard of before.
Yeah, I think a lot of Christians are shy about apocryphal reading. A lot of Christians are shy about things they've taken out. I just feel like this was done by man. Like this wasn't how it was to be presented, all chopped up like this. And I think you do a great job of bringing a lot of answers together for people.
Yeah, and I want to make clear I'm not a prophet.
No, no.
I'm a researcher, and I came back to Christ, kicking and screaming, so to speak. I was pretty stiff-necked, and so, but
That's the best kind.
yeah, but once I started to, and I was came back on a challenge in terms of a book that I was asked to read, and I wanted to verify things, and to do that, you have to really get into the Bible and read it, and so I was absolutely um, disinterested and bored with the Old Testament as I
Yeah.
slugged my way through it, the first few reads. But in the first read, when I started to read the gospel from Matthew through the four gospels, and then in support of the other disciples and apostles, and that scripture, those first four gospels, it struck me probably by the time I was halfway through Mark. So not the first book, because I'm a contrarian, I'm
Right.
stiff-necked, and things like that. Uh, it just hit me like no human can speak this way.
Right.
This is
Right.
The words coming out are so preternatural that even the Pharisees who had the scriptures Jesus was referencing, they didn't understand what he was saying. And it just hit me that this has to be whom he says he is. And if
Right.
that's the case, then I better really get serious about this, because it changed my preconceived notions completely. And I was brought up in the church, but through education and peer pressure, by the time I was a teenager, I had bought into the ridiculous theory of evolution and secular ideology. And even though it doesn't stand the test of criticism and mathematics in a lot of cases in terms of the possible timelines, um, yeah, I realized, I had to have more faith to believe in that than I would have to believe in what Jesus said.
Right. And so you kind of came back around and got Bible slapped or
Yes, yes,
whatnot.
smitten and humbled many times, let me tell you. So um,
But you're here now and look at
I'm
all
here
this
now.
wisdom.
Yeah,
So, yeah, that's wonderful. And I think that it's just so important that things that are left out or the things that people can believe that we went to the moon, and I'm not going to debate it, but okay, whatever. We go to space, we do these other things that we're not there for. We don't know, one way or another. We're not there, but they have the hardest time believing in giants. And I'm like,
yeah.
it's bananas to me. Why?
Yeah,
I
it's crazy, and with the church, and the people in the church are brainwashed to think like the ministers are teaching, and understand that they're not taught prehistory or prophecy in the seminary schools and are told not to teach it. So if we
Mhm.
are in the fig tree generation, they're not preparing the flocks, which is the biggest issue. But they do talk about so many preternatural things in what they do teach about, but they don't want to talk about other preternatural things in the Bible that makes them a little bit uncomfortable with. And it
Right.
just shows you that they have been bent to the wisdom of this world, not bent to the wisdom of heaven,
Mhm.
and that they are, um, you know, they're they're they've kind of lost themselves, um, and led themselves away from what they're there to do, and it's unfortunate.
Mhm. I agree. I agree with that, and I'm sure when you first started doing this, I don't think you probably got a open-armed reception from, churches and or Christians probably, because this is a
Nope.
touchy subject with a lot of
Yep.
people, and so,
Or
I
Christian
mean, it
publishers.
right, right,
You
to even
mentioned
get it
Genesis
out.
6, and most Christian publishers will say, "We will not touch you with a 10-foot pole," so to speak.
Right, so this was a literal work of love, like, I can't imagine that you were thinking it would even get out that well or whatever, but here you are trying to prepare flocks that are not even people that you know. I mean,
Yeah.
you're just doing God's work, and that is, I mean, if we could all try our best, right? Everybody
Sure,
has a different work. Yeah,
and if you disagree with what I say, make your argument scriptural.
right,
And don't
right.
manipulate the scripture, and don't leave out inconvenient passages, and we can have a respectful discussion.
Yeah,
And I would be respectful anyways, but I would be saying, Well, you have to be
This is
careful with
what
what
it
you're
is.
saying because
Yeah.
you're
Right? It is what it
misconvinced.
is. We
It
can't
is what it
change
is.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we can't change the words. And I know that you've been delving into more of even the Hebrew and the Greek
Mhm.
and all those parts of it. And I mean, people don't really do that. I feel like the
Yeah.
people that do come at me sometimes in a different instance, like with Mormonism, and
Yeah.
I'll talk to Mormons that are in versus I'm an anti-Mormon now. And I say, but this, and they'll know, like you said, little things, and then
Yep.
they'll leave out big things, and they're
Yes.
like, oh, JK. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and in book one, I do deal with a lot of etymology, which really got a lot of people's interest up as well. But what I didn't do is I didn't get behind the etymology in a significant, detailed way because the book is really huge as it is. And I wanted to keep it from not manipulating in any way or fashion what the spurious forces had to say on something. I wanted them to speak for themselves, indict themselves, and then we measure what's in the Bible and see what is a polytheist lens on the same event or end time prophecy. And where it diverts, let's understand that's their belief system. And it doesn't matter whether or not we believe that or not.
Mhm.
It's what they believe and what they're doing with that belief system that we need to understand. So I get into etymology and Hebrew and Greek, unlike what I did in the first book, and in a way where I'm putting the footnotes on the front page this time, not on the front page, but on the same page, because there's so much information
Yes.
on it. I want people to read it and then look down and have that information right there for them. Costs a little bit more to do that, but it's just again, I don't want to didn't want to be so into the minutia in a paragraph that but and then not leave out
Right.
the information. So I still wanted it sort of visible there. And I would call it, if you like Dr. Heiser's work, and I can't say I've read any of his work, but he's quite famous and I've heard a lot about it. I would say from what I heard of what he wrote and taught is this is Dr. Heiser on steroids in a lot of cases in
Right.
terms of how
Right.
deep it goes.
Right. This is amazing because I mean, I know I followed you for a long time, and I know you said you would not ever do a second book. You were like, no,
Nope, nope.
I'm good.
I didn't want
Yeah.
to be redundant, and I didn't see
Right.
the angle as to
Right.
why, because I took 300 pages out of the first book just to get it down to a size where somebody might try and take the venture or the journey. And so I thought, all you're going to do is just write more about the same thing. But so I had to learn how to understand that they weren't looking for the redundancy. They wanted things between the lines filled in a lot more. And
Right.
so, and what writing book two did was it showed me how to write book three that I was unable to do. And
Mhm.
I've been actively rewriting that whole book and, expecting, I think I'm going to take a couple of years to get it right. And
Right.
there'll be a part three out, but that goes in a different direction still, particularly with the prophecy. So begins with giants
Oh boy.
and covenants, and then goes into Israel, lost tribes, and prophecies for them specifically for the end time and how that meshes into the chronology.
Okay, so those for those that don't know, maybe kind of explain a little bit about just a brief synopsis of what your work is mostly circled at first around giants and the Nephilim and the angels, and like it gets into a lot more, but like this is I think where people see it to begin to pull them in because
Yeah.
this is all the great stuff they take out, right? Like why take out the good part? This is so
Yeah.
bad.
Yeah, I mean, like in book three, I mean, people they don't really understand that, the first sort of promises and things that are made are done at the time of Adam, and then giants are created not that long afterwards. And then Noah gets a building set of covenants on top of the promises to Adam. And then after the flood, giants resurface again, and those covenants get added on to Abraham and into Isaac and into Jacob and down to the Holy Covenant,
Right.
right? So it's all intermixing with these giants in, both before and after the flood in the days of Noah.
And it's so funny to me because people will say, "Oh, giants, oh they're dead. The flood killed them."
Yeah.
That's all. Or they're locked up. That's all. And
Yeah.
I'm
So
like, "I don't think so."
And one of the
Uh,
things that I didn't want to get into in a lot of detail in book 1 was about Rephaim, because you have two different terms for giants. Some people would say three with Gibborim. Um, and there is one passage in the Bible in Job 16 where it translates Gibborim as a giant, and you could decide whether that's an accurate translation from the word mighty one or not in that application. I think it's fine either way, actually. But Nephilim is only mentioned 3 times in the Bible.
Right.
And it's once in Genesis 6:4 in the creation, and then twice in Numbers 13:33 in the embellished evil report of the terrified scouts who
Yes.
didn't want to go fight these giants. So they said the Anakim. And in book 2, I solidify, don't call them ites, because Israelites weren't giants. In Hebrew, I am is the suffix in the male plural. So Nephilim, Seraphim, Rephaim. So it says that the Anakim were children of the giants twice. And that's the
Okay.
Nephilim word. And what's going on there is that they are trying to scare the Israelites. Not that there aren't giants, but that it brings an understanding of the veracity and the difference between the giants before the flood and after the flood, that they are even more horrible, larger,
Oh boy.
bigger, more terrifying than the post-Diluvian giants. And they use that reference so that they don't have to go up and take them on. And we know there's two kinds of people in the accurate part of the report done by Caleb and Joshua, that there are people stronger and taller than Israel, and these are the hybrids, where we're introduced to that. And I get into how we know about hybrids in the new in the post-Diluvian epoch. But they also mention the 3 Anakim kings of Hebron, or Kiriath Arba, which was the patriarch for the Anakim. And not in the table of nations, of course, because Rephaim patriarchs aren't listed in the table of nations of
Yes.
Genesis 10, First Chronicles, but you do get an addendum onto Chronicles, and shows up in Genesis and Genesis 36 with the Horim kings and the dukes of Seir, the dukes of Edom, and gives you that part of the table of nations, so you have a better understanding what's going on in the Testament, but not as descendants of Noah. Right?
Right.
These are
Right.
hybrids that are going to be created, or giants that are being talked about that are in addition. And so in Numbers 13:33, these are called the Anakim, and then the reference has how. And by the way, all the details to the accurate part of the report, and most people forget about this, and if you're not ready for it, those who are trying to wedge doubt in you will cite, well, all of that report was the evil report, but there's clearly 2 people discussing. And then Deuteronomy 1, 40 years later, Moses is reciting the same details and confirming the Anakim kings were there, and that the people were taller and stronger, the Israel that were separate. And those people are, hybrid tribes like the Amorites, the Amalekites, the Canaanites. And again, that's why I spent a lot of time on the hybrids in book 2. But when you get it for a definition and a comparative passage about the Anakim, the defining passage comes out of Deuteronomy 2. And it says the Anakim were giants. So Nephilim is embellished, but the word there is Rapha, the singular form of Rephaim for a tribe of giants. And that they are different than the Nephilim. Somehow, some way, they're probably a little bit smaller. Not 7 to 9 feet tall that the hybrids are, but somewhere between, let's say, 10 and 19 feet tall after the flood by the dimensions that were provided, with a 2-to-1 height to width ratio, so stout and strong.
Right. Wow.
Just as Og's bed dimension was kept at Rabbah on display for hundreds of years, to show the people that the people they fought against were giants, and never to forget
This
that.
was
And the bed
real.
was,
Yeah.
yeah, and the bed
Yeah.
was made of iron because it couldn't hold their weight. So Rephaim are the post-Diluvian giants, and that's used over 25 times in the Old Testament, not over 25 times. and that twice it is actually translated as Rephaim in the King James Version Bible. And that's as a tribe of giants in Genesis 14, which is the War of Giants. And then amongst the mighty 7 of the mighty 10, and I discussed the mighty 10, the hybrids and the giant nations within there as well in book 2, and take them back to patriarchs and some of them to fallen angels. And that's the land that Abraham is promised. So immediately after the War of Giants, you have the promise of the land from the Nile to the Euphrates to be part of Abraham's covenant and for his descendants. So all of that is part of the mix. And then people will say, well, giants aren't really giants.
Right. They're just, they were just tall. Yeah.
They're just sort of tall.
Yeah.
And 7, 8 feet tall. Well, don't confuse. That's why you have to understand the hybrids. Don't let them do that to you.
Yes.
And the word Nephilim, they say, well, you could define that as a tyrant or a bully. And that part is true as well. In the Hebrew for 5303 Nephil, and that's the singular. I am is the plural. Well, let's look at the word tyrant. And tyrant is, and I talk a little bit about this in book 1, and I really nail it down in book 2 for the exact sort of lineage of how people say that the Tyrannos is linked to the giants in the land of the covenant, particularly through the Philistine kings. And those ones in Ezekiel that are referenced as these evil beast-like kings. And I cover the beast kings in book 2 as well. So the Tyrannos goes back to Greek for a lineage of kings. And these are dynastic kings. And they go back to the original patriarch, which is giants, and these are all giant lineages downstream and created from the gods. And one goes back to sort of Hercules as the Herculides bloodline and you see these Gygi and Gygus kings as you get them transliterated. And there's a reason why there's a Y sound and a G sound that's important. And you also have a lineage of just the Gygi kings or the Gygus kings. But they're considered synonymous because the Herculides is just one branch of these giant kings. And
Don't
so
you find it
they were called
so
Tyrannos because they were so evil. And that's where tyrant comes from. So, and I'll just finish off and then I'll get to the other bully
No, you're
one.
good.
That bully
I
that
find it
people will talk about.
so interesting that if you go to other countries,
Yep.
they don't call this mythology, they call it history.
Yes, they do.
Exactly what you're saying. Yeah, it's
and so some people will say, well, gigantic goes back to earthborn and doesn't go back to being a giant. They're just earthborn and they're taller. Giant is the tyranny imposed upon the English language, as we're supposed to believe, except that gigantic has its etymology in the word gigas, Gigas, as we would transliterate it. And when it ends in an A, in this case, it makes the G sound and it's singular. And when it's an E, then it's pronounced as a Y for plural. So Gaies or Gygas. And so when you see that translation for kings in Greek mythology or other references, that's what it's talking about. And gigantes is rooted in Gygas or Gyentes in the plural. So singular would be with an A, plural is with an E, and it makes that sound Y. So the etymology for gigantic comes from Gygas. The etymology for giant comes from both giantes, gigantic, and giant as it's transliterated as in plural for giants, or giant and singular, which they conflate the two with that, and Gygas again. So it all goes back to the actual word giant, and the gigantes were understood as these monstrous 100-armed giants that Gaia created. And there was also giant kings that came from the gods to create the demigods. And one of those gigantes was named Gyges in singular.
Okay, so there's, I mean, these are people that are writing a book, and back then, not even everyone knew how to read. So this would
Yeah.
be important. This is
Yeah.
why you're focusing. Yeah, because it meant something different.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
very different.
So yeah, gigantic is related as an extension from the source word, to give you the fuller meaning, just as you get that out of Hebrew and Greek in the New Testament. But it's not, doesn't mean that just because gigantic is one of the sources for giant in English from
Right.
Greek doesn't mean you dismiss the other one. And again, if they're leaving out information or details or passages in the Bible to make their argument, there's something wrong there that's fairly
Little
easily found
fishy.
out. Yeah. So the other term is bully. So there are bullies. There's lots of bullies. We have bullies today. Well, the gods were called bulls. And particularly where we get that account comes out of the Ugaritic text, where it has Baal and Ashtaroth as the creator of the Rephaim giants after the flood. And they rule from the council of the gods on Mount Hermon. And they have a council of the Dat-Tanu, or the Tanu there, which are all different kinds of giants. And it's kind of the root word for Tuatha Dudanan, or the tribe of Danu. There's a lot of different transliterations for that. And that both the gods were called the kings, as were the giants in the Ugaritic texts. And of course, it's the Baalim and the Baalim Council, which is mostly focused on in the Bible. Right. And that the Ugaritic texts were written in Semitic, which is the root language for Hebrew. And so you can actually take RPM, which is original Semitic for Rephaim, as it's transliterated into English today as Rapiu or Rapium. Just as you have with Nephilim, the old pronunciation was Nephilim, with a P and the H is silent, whereas today we now do it as a PH. It's sort of the evolution of the language. Rephaim has the same etymological history. So RPM is in the same evolution as Nephilim and Rephaim has. So these are the giants that are terrifying the covenant land where the Baalim rules, and they're doing rituals to bring Baal and Ashtaroth back because they have a fertility issue. And that they want them to produce more giants. But they don't come back because they can't. They can't walk amongst us again because, like their parents, and in this case, El and Astarte, and other names for the parent gods before the flood, they were already sent to the prison. They created giants before the flood. They're offspring gods who move up in rank and order, and I cover off Saba and the army of angels, and that's translated as host of heaven from Saba. Host means an army of angels that they would move up afterwards. And then they did the same crimes as their parents did. They went off to the pit prison as well, sometime by Babel or shortly thereafter. And that's who the people from Babel intermarry with, is all of these giants that have been recreated after the flood or survived, depending on how you get there. Might be both. I lean heavily towards second incursion. And that in the book, I'll cover off that they take the daughters of Canaan to make those giants. And it's important to understand the timing from the time of Babel and the time of the end of the flood. It's about 100 years. But on Ararat, the mountain of the curse, as Ararat is defined, Ham defiles Noah, but Ham doesn't receive the full curse. It's actually a curse and a prophecy, which is kind of unique. It's a unique, just as the Genesis 3:15, the seed of the serpent curse prophecy is the same type. This curse does not affect Ham. It does not affect Cush, does not affect any of the other brothers except for Canaan. And so, in spite, and to try and, I think, my speculation, to limit the aspects of serving their brethren and serving Israel, who would come about, they decided they would intermarry after Babel with those giants and create all sorts of hybrids amongst them, which we can talk about if you want. So
Yeah.
later,
Yeah.
but just to sort of
That's
give
great.
some connections to what's going on here is that these Rephaim, they're going to come back to my original point is that because of that fertility issue, they have an incentive to intermarry with Canaanites and other peoples in other locations outside the covenant land, lest they go extinct.
Right. So they have to do something. Yeah.
Yeah. And we know that they have a fertility issue from this passage of these tyrants in Ezekiel 32, which includes the Pharaoh, who's a beast king empire, and Rephaim
And
bloodline.
those heads are not just from cradle stuff. Come on now, or wrapping. Let's get real. They had a lot of them that are they're digging up now that have red hair. They
Yeah,
have red hair.
red hair and blonde
And
hair.
yeah,
Yeah,
I'm like, okay, this is no, I
yeah.
don't believe it.
You can create that shape, but you can't increase the volume,
No. Yep.
and you can't get rid of the sutures. So when you
Yes.
say King Akhenaten, Egyptian bloodline down from, that would be connected within the Pharaoh bloodlines. And he's like over 1,000 years after the flood. And so there's a dilution going on because they have to intermarry. He has this big elongated skull.
Yeah.
If he's not shown without this big, huge cap to cover that elongated skull,
Yes.
he's depicted both ways. And he still has his seraphim serpentine look to his face with these high cheekbones, protruding chin, this big, humongous cone head, these large
Yeah.
eyes that are wrap around
It's not
and would
natural.
glow.
There's no
Yeah.
way. Yeah, there's no way.
Yeah. So these are the
No.
terrible ones as Pharaoh is being talked about, just as Akhenaten would be a terrible one in Ezekiel 32. And they're speaking to the terrible ones that Pharaoh is speaking to they are in prison in the sides of the pit in Ezekiel 32. They're talking to Pharaoh in this creepy dual prophecy, as I like to talk about it. And also the mighty are talking to Pharaoh as well. And that goes back to the Hebrew word El for an angel or a god. So these are the parent gods, the offspring gods, and the terrible ones who were slain and went to the pit prison and are speaking to another terrible one. And that's the Hebrew word erit. And that in its plural, as in ones in plural, as opposed to a terrible one, would be eritim. So in that definition of these terrible ones, which are the Rephaim, and speaking to one of their brethren that's on the Pharaoh throne, they are described as giants would be described as in the definition. But the key two elements in that large definition is, infertility and childless. So they have a fertility issue that shows up more in a inability to produce females more than a semen or an ovary issue.
Okay.
And that gets to be the issue, and doublefold, because in their warlike nature, when they capture other rival kings or giants, they used to slaughter the harem along with it, and so they're in self-inflicting a lot of that infertility issue. So that's why they're trying to have, in the Ugaritic text, they're doing fertility rituals to bring Baal and Ashtaroth back to create more giants. And King Og is the last of the Rephaim, last of the giants. That's the Hebrew word Rapha, not Nephilim, post-Diluvian giant. And he's the last of that first generation. And he actually moves to Mount Hermon after the War of Giants and takes over and rules over Amorites, which are hybrids, and sets up 60-city Pentapolis empire. It's the most powerful empire of the giants, even larger than Sihon, who has about 30 to 35 cities, as you count that in the Bible. And that would be 5 to 6 Pentapolis, so half the size. So there might even be more that weren't listed, but we're told that there are 60 cities of Og in the Bible. And so that starts to make sense of the terrible ones. why King Og is ruling over the Amorites. If you understand, the Rephaim are almost wiped out in the War of Giants there, and there's a void. And Og probably moves there. Well, how do I get there? Well, I was talking about the Ugaritic text. And that second word of the compound word is arit, meaning terrible one.
Mm. There you
Uh,
go.
yeah, and UG is the transliteration for Og. So UWG in Hebrew, rooted in OWE, and Ug is thought to be a word for a king too. So
Oh.
yeah, and I cover off some of those different variations, but what it's saying is this is the city of Og, the terrible one. So just as you
Mhm.
have Hebron, which was originally named Kiriath Arba, the city of Arba, the patriarch of the Anakim, this is now the Kiriath Ug Arit, the city of Og, the terrible one.
Mhm.
And he's Rephaim, and all of these
There you go.
giants are Rephaim and the tribe of Datanu recorded in the Ugaritic text. So it starts to make some sense out of these titles and words and names. And of course, Rapha does not show up in the
Right.
table of nations. Why? Because he's Rephaim
Right. They're not
as
going to
the
put that.
patriarch. Yeah, so you can understand and translate. So you have to be careful. It can be a name, which you have a couple people named as Rapha throughout the Old Testament. It can also mean a generic name for a giant, as it's used, like the Valley of Giants, the Valley of the Rephaim. And it could be a specific sort of patriarch of the tribe. And so we have to be careful in the application of that, but all of it's going back to meaning giants. And bully fits with as being a bull of Bashan, where Og
Right.
ruled and the Rephaim ruled from. Everything starts to fit because Bashan is in the Mount Hermon region. Of course, he would want to be
Right.
king of that region as well. So everything sort of starts to fit with all of the definitions, the history, and the parallel accounts. The consistency is just absolutely extraordinary.
Right. It wouldn't fit like a puzzle if it was just
Yeah.
nonsense. I mean,
Yeah.
it can't.
So
Yeah,
when
I agree.
Christ is depicted on the cross in the book of Psalms, where he's surrounded by the bulls of Bashan,
Mm.
they're talking
Oh,
about
that
the
makes
Baalim and their spurious offspring, the disembodied spirits of those giants, not in the pit prison.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that makes a lot more sense with that definition. That I wouldn't even have put that together. That's awesome, actually. Oh my. Not awesome for him. I'm just saying on the definition. Probably not at all. But
And
yes, that's fits well. I can see where you're going there.
yeah, and it used to be a lot of people would say to me that you talk about all these bloodlines, but we don't get told about these bloodlines in the Bible, and you do. You just don't recognize it, and that
Right.
you get genealogies and you get patriarchal names that come down through history. And I like in book 1, I talked about Agag as being the Agagite king of the Amalekites in the time of the Exodus. There's an Agag in the time of King Saul and King David, or later, well, David's alive at that time. And then there's an Agagite, which is thought to be synonymous in its understanding and meaning for Amalekite, and reflective of a bloodline of the Agagite dynasty who sits at the throne of the Persian Empire.
That's what,
Um,
people always
um,
ask me, my mother-in-law,
yeah,
when I was trying to explain some things, and she said, "Well, who was they?" Because I said, "Well, they run," when you're talking to people, "These people run the world, they run the world." And she said,
yeah,
"Well, who is they?" And I thought, "Uh-oh, this is gonna be fun."
yeah,
Okay, and I started kind of explaining, like, there's these 13 bloodline families, but I know there's more than that. That's
yeah,
just for each region.
yeah,
And I was trying to explain, and you lose people so
yeah.
fast because they just think you're gone,
Yeah,
you know?
you're just out there, absolutely.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so Haman the Agagite is trying to wipe the remnant of Judah from the face of the earth, and he's got the highest position around all the vassal kings that report to the emperor. And that's not, I mean, you just wouldn't have a nobody
Right.
promoted to
Because it
that
wouldn't
sort of
matter.
level. Yeah, and is carrying out the blood oath to wipe Israel from the face of the earth, just that the Nephilim were created
Hmm.
to wipe us out from the face of the earth so that we would not reach our destiny. So these are these royal bloodlines, and you do get royale talked about in the Old Testament, and royale means kings of God. As you take that back when it's etymology through Old French roi and back to Latin for regal and words like that, majestic, all words that are associated with the royales. And al is the transliteration of el, just as il is in other language, like in Babalu or something, or the gateway of the gods, as they would understand Babel, as opposed to confusion of languages. And so we see that in Baal, which in the occult means Lord God or Master God.
Hmm.
And the AL is that transliteration of EL.
Yeah. That's why a lot of times when you see these people praying to their Lord, or
Yeah,
they'll specifically say their God, they don't like Jesus. They don't say that word.
yeah,
Um, but they'll say, "Oh, well, look, he's a Christian. Look, he says, thank you to, his Lord." And I'm
yeah,
like, that doesn't always mean what you think it means.
yeah. And and Royale is understood as a majestic dynastic line of
Yeah.
pure bloods that go back to a specific patriarch of a dynasty.
Mm,
And of course, they
wow.
take their genealogies back to specific patriarchs, as in the Julia gens of the black nobility, of the older black nobility in Italy, or the Rex Deus, as I call them, or Rex Deus in book one, also means kings of God. And they get their divine right to rule from the Baalim gods. And they swear their oath in this divine right of inheritance that we just saw again with King Charles III, that goes back into this prehistory. And it's not to the God of the Bible, it's to a specific celestial mafia godfather that created them, that they're loyal to.
Right.
And that's who
Right.
they swear that oath to in their oath-based society that was created at the time of mysticism before the flood by Enoch, son of Cain, and the
Mhm.
oath of Haram anathema on Mount Hermon, as the book of Enoch talks about, that the angel swore to carry it out to the end, and went to create the giants to wipe out humankind from the face of the earth. So it's sort of all interconnected. And I used to ask a question, and I'm asking it more because I realize that what I should be bringing it up in some of the talk shows is, what makes a royale? What
Right.
makes
What gives
them?
them that divine right? Right. It's
Yeah,
blood. It's
yeah. Why
blood.
do they think they're superior?
It's the
They
blood.
think of themselves as demigods because that's the
Hmm.
genealogies that they keep track of that takes them back to it. And they've been
Yes.
ruling over us both before and after the flood. And they created the 4-class system, with them populating the upper 2 class. And we only get the small entrepreneurial class of bakers, tailors, blacksmiths, things like that. And the rest is the slave and ritual class, or the slave and the work class that they need. So they populate all of that. And if it's going to be like the days of Noah, they're going to bring that 4-class system in, which is why you've got this war on the middle class to reduce
Mm.
them back to that level where they populate the complete upper class of oligarchs with the large business, all of the religious class, all of the class of the educated class, the elite, all of the governance class,
Well,
and
and I have
the
so many
army
questions, and
class
I'm
ruling. Yep.
I'm gonna save them to the end. But on this part right here, on this class thing, it also goes right along with, look at what's happening to the human population, because what's
Yeah.
happening now, we're having infertility,
Yeah.
just like the giants of old. They know this game and they know how to play it.
They
Like,
do. They
yeah,
do. They control
yep,
everything.
I agree. 100%. I totally agree.
And there are passages in the Bible that talks to us about this seed line. There's
Yes.
an appointed seed, and then there's the spurious seed, or the serpent seed. So I do cover the serpent seed as it connects to the serpent's root that's talked about in Isaiah 14, which is the passage of Satan falling from heaven and
He's-
wanting to be raised up like gods, and it's all sort of interconnected. So it's a large prophecy and it starts at the beginning of 13 and goes through to the end of 14. And so in Genesis 3:15, you have this curse prophecy where the serpent is there's going to be enmity between the seed and the woman. So it's a curse that takes the Nahash, the serpent, back down to what we understand it today from this larger than human, intelligent, walking, talking, sentient being that's been led astray by the fallen angels that deceives Eve in the garden and reduced to what it is today for participating in that fall. And now you can say, let's say Satan coached him or entered into him to give him the wisdom to be able to do that. But it's not Satan who was punished for this. It was the Nahash. So you're not going to see serpentine seed with Eve through a snake in that passage,
Right.
but it is a prophecy and a curse prophecy like the Ham one. And I think it's fulfilled in Genesis 6 with the Serum Watchers, the serpentine faced watchers that first create this spurious seed. That is in the preamble to the flood story and the context for the flood story and all the violence that they bring and all the angelic technology that completely corrupts the entire world. So we get that and a fulfillment, and we get these giants again after the flood. And then you get, and I was talked about the terrible ones as this branch of the terrible ones, as they're called in Isaiah 25, that I talk about, that are going to be killed on a mountain in the end time, which is, again, I cover off that and building on what Dr. Heiser talks about with Armageddon, but in a whole bunch of different ways in addition to it. And you get this prophecy in the end time in Daniel 2 and Daniel 2:43 that talks about they, as in the descendants of the metallic empires and the descendants of at least the Roman Empire, as it rises again in the end time as these 10 kings. But understand you have a degrading metal. That's a degrading bloodline within this giant statue that's in the vision. And all the words are saying it's a giant, as in statue. So it's these beast empires. And here's what it says in Daniel 2:43. It says, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men. That happens in the end time. So there's a different seed line here, just as Genesis 3 and Isaiah 14, 25 and Isaiah 25 and Isaiah 14 is talking about. But the strongest one is Psalms 21:8. And if people have never looked at that, I would really encourage people to look at it, because what it's talking about there is it's giving a time of the end, and where there is a time of a fiery oven in the King James Version. I use the KJV in book 2, and a time of his anger in the time of wrath. This is all end time languages in the year of the Lord's wrath and the ultimate battle at Armageddon on that mountain where those terrible ones are going to be destroyed. It then goes into Psalms 21:10, where it says, their fruit shall thou destroy from the face of the earth. And if that wasn't strong enough, it says, and their seed from among the children of men. So if people say that there isn't any biblical evidence to a bloodline that is going to be separated and dealt with in the end time, then have another look. And then I also cover off in the prophetic side how we can make the cognate words in Greek and take cognate words in Greek and Hebrew and match them up to know that we're talking about the same thing. So when it's talking about the great and mighty men in like the book of Revelation, I'll take that back to Megas and Megastrani. That all goes back to describing giants.
Wow. It just is a huge connection. I mean, if people research this like you're showing them to do, you're laying it out. It's not going to be hard. Like I'm sure you had to go search. This is an easy connect.
And I'm going to show you right there on the page where it comes from and any additional information. And people can check the veracity of my research. So there are over 100 pages of endnotes in book 1. This will actually have more. It's just not all grouped in one place. It's as a
together.
footnote on the same
I
page.
think that's a great idea. Yeah, I think that'll help a lot. Then you can just see it, like you said, right there.
Yeah, and you've got my bibliography, so you can go get the books yourself. if you
Right,
want.
right, exactly. Yeah, if you wanna make sure that this is not some
Yep.
wild thing, then you can go look at that yourself,
Yep.
you
Yep.
know? That's
And see whether or
great.
not I've quoted it or described it
Yes.
accurately.
Right, right, exactly. That sounds great. This is gonna be a great addition to everything you've already put out, and I can't imagine how much time this has taken you because it is lengthy and in depth,
Yep.
which is exactly what we need. I mean, it's we gotta get to the point of things because the world is changing rapidly.
And in book 2, in the transition, I'll cover off a little bit more on, I know, subjects that you're interested. I'll do a little bit more on secret societies in book 2.
Yeah.
So, one thing
Yes,
I didn't
secret
cover in book
societies.
1 was the Jesuits. And
Right.
I give the whole basis for their creation as the new Templars and the sources. In book 2, I cover that off, and then I connect them into the Mary apparitions and the takeover of the Roman Church in preparation for the end time, and show you how that all sorts of fits in, how they fit into the hierarchy of the secret societies. And then I also provide two interesting things that goes along first with what we've talking about with the bloodlines, and then the
Mhm.
power structure. So they have two allegorical trees that they like to use, and they connect back to, of course, to where Mount Hermon, and one
Right.
being the elm tree that I talk about in book 1. Just as the Templars did their business under a great elm in Paris, and the cutting of the elm split the lower junior branch of the Knights Templar order away from the senior order of the Priory of Sion at the Castle of Geysers in 1188, after the Templars lost Jerusalem in 1187, because they lost their way and their main mission, for the secret societies. And so ash, oak, and elm are kind of used a bit interchangeably in the Bible, and I show those applications so people know what I'm talking about. So when it's talking about the oaks of Bashan, and when it's describing, for example, the Amorites and their size, they're strong as the oaks of Bashan. Um, this is that tree that's being referenced, and the other one for the organizational structure is the cedar of Lebanon. So there's like the size of the cedars of Lebanon, which were like giant trees on 2-to-1
Mm.
height to width ratio, and they became mature, so 100 feet tall to about 50 feet wide. um,
Wow.
yeah, and that's not a simile. It's not an exact measurement for these.
Right.
It's a
Right.
simile, right? So, but it's those two trees that are being used in their allegory here. So one is the genealogical tree, right? The
Right.
family tree. That's an elm
Yes.
tree or an ash tree or an oak tree. And again, if you look around the polytheist religions around the world, they use like the Tuatha De Danann in England and elsewhere, use the oak tree as the most holy tree, but they're considered them kind of the same or the similar, even though they're a little bit different species. But that's the genealogical tree that they do their bloodlines on, with all these different branches. And so that's where that ideology comes from. And I'll take
Hmm.
that back to where that starts in the Middle Ages, and to
Y
kings that get back to the bloodline of the King of Jerusalem title. It's one of them that actually creates this genealogical tree, I think in the 1600s, as I remember. The other one is um, the thalamic tree, as they like to call it.
mm.
And this is an evergreen tree, and it helps you understand the massive size of organizations that they have. So a pyramid doesn't work because there's so many organizations, it just falls apart, and you got to start leaving out organizations, and it just doesn't sort of work.
Right.
So this thalamic tree, is similar to the genealogical tree, just with a different purpose, and it has the roots that go down to their heaven, Hades,
Um,
Sheol, in the earth, in another dimension, where they get the genealogy or the genes from, and the power from, with the divine right to rule. So
mm.
again, their allegories are absolutely astounding, and they take that word out of the Greek, and particularly like it because of it being used in the New Testament, and it's the word that where it says, God's will. Will is thalam, and thalamic is the word that they're taking for thalamic tree for their organizational structure. It's also mistranslated a couple of times in the New Testament to be sexual or orgies and things like that. But that's because it's part of their doctrine, do as you will,
Right.
right?
It's coming from Crowley. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thelema, right?
exactly. So I connect sort of all of that
Yes.
in as well. And that this thelemic tree has a trunk organization.
Okay.
And and when they say do as God's will, they're talking about their specific God of their
Yes. Not,
genealogies, right?
yeah.
That we talked
Right.
about. And it has these branches that intersect all the way through. So imagine this trunk or the set of trunk organizations where you have Freemasonry at the bottom, first level of adepthood at third degree, old system or 33rd degree right, 3 divided 11 ways, all sacred numbers and
Mhm.
that they like to do a lot of in polytheism, the knowledge cult. Um,
Yes.
the knowledge
Obsession with
of
gematria. Yeah.
yeah,
Obsessed.
yeah,
Yeah.
and the knowledge that came from the fallen angels or the gods
Yes.
that merged with
Yes.
the seven sciences. Above that is the Illuminati, and above that is the Rosicrucians, where you get a first intersection of pure bloods with rising levels of lower initiates at adepthood. You have to be bloodline to be an adept. And then as you get into the Rosicrucians, you're now intermixing with European purebloods. And they populate the top half of the Rosicrucian order. And then above that is the Committee of 300 families. And then above that is the Council of 33 families. And above that is the 13 families. And so you have a lot of
Right.
families within this ever-growing sort of hierarchy and how it sort of develops. And I described the connection between the Jesuits and the intersection downwards with the creation of the 300 and or upwards coming out of the Rosicrucians with the creation of the Committee of 300 from the invisible 33 that were the original Rosicrucians after the fall of the Templars with the Priory of Sion and the senior organization. And so you have now all of these branch organizations that enter into a specific trunk organization. And then as that descends down, as like a cedar branch does, you have that hierarchy of all these branches coming back into a main intersection order at the joint or the sioning or the branch level from the trunk that would be part of that organization. And you have all of these branches coming in around the tree. So you would see Freemasonry being involved in all sorts of lower level initiative organizations, not at adept level. And of
Right.
course, they also work with, in terms of their agenda, the army
Mm.
and politics.
And religion, because the
And
Mormons,
yeah, and with the
they are yes.
for yeah,
Talk
so
about Freemason genealogy obsessed people.
yeah,
We're right
typic
in there.
yeah, typically those would be the there's a bit of a crossover there, but typically it would be the Illuminati that would be looking to influence Christianity and any religion that's designed to put out disinformation, redefine the Bible, give them the interpretive approach, add on to the Bible, whatever their standard sort of
All of
tactics
those.
are. Yeah.
All of those things, yes.
Yeah. So if you can imagine all of these going up the tree, so that when you get to the Committee of 300, for example, you can include, because this will answer to most of the business aspect of what goes on in the world, because money controls everything in their world. And so the IMF, the World Bank, the Davos B20 group, anything that's connected into that level of global monetary control will intersect in there, as do the Bilderbergers, for example, that work with the rising new money members. And so they
Yes.
populate the top half of the Bilderbergers and bring in the new money. They bring them in once a year to go out with the marching orders. Just as they bring people in, they have to be invited to go to the World Economic Forum, and then they get their
Yeah.
marching orders and they go out for the year. And so the Jesuits, who are the new Templars, they would intersect in possibly at the original Rosicrucian level, which was the invisible 33. Oh, and particularly through the black nobility or the Julia gens, as they populated many of the popes with their black nobility bloodlines, because they control all of the religions right at the top level. So you could make an argument later on for a junior black nobility that migrated from Phoenicia and the Middle East to Venice and Florence and places like that, that would include the merchants and the traders. And I'm trying to think of the famous banking arm out of Italy in around the 1500s. I can't think of their name, but uh, oh, sorry, it's
It'll
blank. If
come.
I remember it, I'll bring it up. They would be considered part of the black nobility that was in control of reestablishing the Jesuits after their fall back in. But there's two different levels of these of the black nobility there. So you have that possibility that they would answer into the Committee of 300 versus the older black nobility that takes their bloodlines back through Caesar, Augustus, the senator families, back to Romulus or Remus, and the parent gods that created them. So hopefully I wasn't too long in making those sort of connections.
No.
And so the Jesuits would hook in at that higher level, but they're not at the top. And I didn't want to put them in the first book because it was controversial. And I didn't want to make the book another 100 pages to sort of
try and
show you
fit
how
that in
they
there.
intersect.
Yeah. Right. No, that makes complete sense. That makes complete and the thing is it's all like when they say it's a big club and you're not in it, like literally they mean it. I don't know why. Yeah, I don't know why this is so hard for people. I think it's because most people are not psychopathic and they don't understand the thought between you're an ant. You don't think about the ant when you kill the ant. You just want it out of your house, right? That's it. I mean, I hate to say that to people, but
Yeah, they look at us as cattle or
yes.
insects. Yes.
Yep.
They call us
It's
both. That's part of their allegories. And don't get confused, because they have sort of dualism. That's what I call at the micro level or within the belief system versus the dualism. You have this perpetual, their head god being Satan or Lucifer, as the Gnostics and the secret societies also call them. That is in a perpetual battle that never ends against the God of the Bible, who they look at as evil. That's the macro dualism. But inside, they have white hats and black hats.
yes.
So when they're looking at you want to look at some of the names for white hats, you might look at them as they call themselves the gentlemen. Just as no nobility says you have to be a gentleman. That's the ones who say they have the better interest of humankind in their hearts. And the evil ones, the barbarians, the still warrior ones, the ones who cause most of the wars, and they all cause wars. So I don't know how they try and split that, but they're the black hats. So, but you have to understand, even though the black hats want to wipe us from the face of the earth, and the white hats, which is the allegory they also use, seem to have a better view of humankind, they still have the same agenda and they still worship the same pantheon of gods. And it's designed to cattle herd us. That's why I like to use the word cattle as well as insects into their agenda and into a world government and a universal religion that they want to bring about. So it's important to understand that we cannot allow that internal dualism that they have to mislead us. So they have white magic, they have black magic. It's just a constant. There are good giants, there are evil giants. And so I like Elon Musk a lot. I mean, he's a genius and he's helping with free speech, but I'm still not convinced he's not part of that whole hierarchy and a white hat, because, and here's the classic example, is that he's against the evil AI that people like Google are doing. So what's his retort to that? I'm going to create my own company and create good AI. Well, no, all AI is bad. It's all about, and it's always going to be used for evil, even if the best intentions are for good, but it's doing the same agenda from those poles apart positions to cattle herd us into a nexus point.
Yeah, it's still fallen angel technology that was widely blown open
Yeah.
with John D. I feel
Yeah.
like John D is the mecca of a lot of this stuff as far as bringing it into the population. Not that it
Yeah.
didn't exist before, but the introduction of the Enochian alphabet and all this when he was
Yeah.
conjuring, he got so much information at that point that not that it didn't exist before, but it made it more, I guess, mainstream back in the day.
Yes. It
Like,
got
yes.
collected and
Yeah.
then was being redistributed in various sort of aspects. And what's important about John D, he's also, that's where 007 comes from.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but he was a very important figure in the Queen Elizabeth court. But
Yes.
his greater influence, um, as an extension out of this occult knowledge, is he mentored Francis Bacon.
Mhm. And he's actually the coiner of a one world order. I mean,
Yeah.
people just miss on him. And I'm
Yeah.
like, none of this would have came from anywhere else if it hadn't started there. I mean, eventually it trickled down, even though he was, I mean, an utter failure in his lifetime. That didn't really work out for him, other than his mathematics. But they didn't take him serious until later, as we often see. But
You're
I
referring to
mean,
John D?
yes, how
Yes.
they
Yep.
just kind of
Yep.
thought he was
Yep.
crazy because of the occultic
Yep.
stuff. Yeah.
Well, and he was a
Um,
special ambassador of Queen Elizabeth. There's no
yes.
way that superficial history that we're provided is accurate,
Mm-mm.
because they don't know, they didn't want too much light put on them. And just as Francis Bacon is always recreated in a different sort of light as well. And he was the most powerful individual at the latter
Mhm.
half of Queen Elizabeth's reign. And then when King James comes to power, the
Yeah.
mighty King James, as he liked to call himself, as of the Unicorn Dynasty, different rabbit hole. But Francis Bacon, he wrote the New Atlantis, which I think what you
Yes.
were referring to, as well as many alchemical books, all of the
Mhm.
knowledge coming from John D. And that the New Atlantis is where you have science coming back and merging with religion, as it was in Enochian mysticism and at
Mhm.
Babel, to be the
It's
religion of the world in the end time. And the Atlantis is not a misplaced or an exaggerated term. It's what they actually believe, because Atlantis had 10 kings spawned by, in the mythos from Plato and Critias, Poseidon marrying Clymene to produce 10 giant kings to reign over Atlantis, which was the golden age and the
Mhm.
model that they were trying to create with the development of the sciences and trying to conquer the whole world militarily, um,
Mhm.
which brought on the flood. It's the violence part of the flood as you connect back, and the knowledge that corrupted the earth, or shakath, meaning decay, pervert, ruin, destroy, for the plant genomes, and the DNA of all human, and starts to answer a lot more questions about the language of corrupt and violence when you understand the larger context. And this is the religion that's going to reign with these 10 kings that they want to bring back. So it's going to be like the days of Noah, when
Mhm.
the angels walked amongst us, produced those spurious bloodlines, and it's the same number of the 10 kings that are talked about, 10 kings, 10 horns, or 10 toes.
Mhm.
Daniel 2, 7. Let's throw 8 in there as well, as it talks about parts of that. Revelation 12, 13, and 17,
Revelations.
where you get those convergence of those numbers for the empire, the seventh empire of the last time, that makes the way for Antichrist. And
Mhm.
it's the Club of Rome that answers into the Committee of 300, that separated the world into 10 zones that they want to see this end time empire develop in. And they were formed in the late 60s to speed this process up. And they've been frustrated, but again, it's a similar mapping to what the UN has used to split the world into 10 organizations. And you have this, this logo of the UN with this laurel wreath over a flat earth, and the meridians and longitudes that they created in the 1600s for their mapping of their world that they have legal tender over for a limited time. And the laurel wreath is the crown that gods wore in the time of Greek mythology, and the simple white cloth. So when you get into the Greek of a bow and a crown in Revelation 6, that crown is this laurel wreath. As you take that back to the Greek and the understanding that it was the same crown used for gods and for the awarding of athletes at their Olympic Games, which would have been Nephilim again, or giant,
Right.
right? Just by understanding the context of the scenario. And that the bow is not a weapon. It means a simple cloth. So white cloth of the gods. So you can expect that sort of imagery to be part of what's coming for the Seventh Empire and the universal religion, just as you had the beast empires of old as part of having part of its hierarchy, the beast religion that comes from Babel, that comes from Enochian mysticism. And Babel is the root word for Babylon, for the Babylon religion that rides the empire of beasts in Revelation 17.
And do you think that this is what the DNA tests are doing? Like they've used these. Do you think they're searching and separating us?
Yeah, they're looking for who's got the right DNA or the right blood type, and blood types can skip a generation. So it's the gene that you need to focus on because it makes the blood type and answers the question of how Rh negative gets added to the bloodlines when it's missing the D antigen. I mean, it's not that, it's the gene.
I always was fascinated. This grandma I have here up on my wall was the whole reason why I ever even heard the word Nephilim. It was a joke at my house. This was my great grandma,
yeah,
and she had O negative blood. And it was always a joke that she was a Nephilim. And we would laugh about it, but I didn't really know what that meant. You know, as a child growing up, I knew it was a joke. I knew she couldn't have babies.
yeah,
Normally she had like 3 or 4 babies die at stillbirth type situation. Really horrible. Because it was before they had any
drugs.
knowledge of what to do.
Yeah,
Yeah,
they
they
didn't have the
really
drugs
didn't
to
know.
apply to overcome that. Yeah.
Yep. And so
And
the RH factor coming out in 1944 is fascinating to me that it took, like, look, that's not that long ago.
yeah,
That's, I mean, that's kind of frightening to know that there's something introduced into
yeah,
our society that has
yep.
changed something. And then
And it,
they've got the one, even the null, the RH null
yeah,
above that, the
yeah,
golden blood.
yeah,
Yeah. And
which is kind of unique in itself as well. Yeah.
yeah, very
And what's
strange.
interesting also about that Rh negative is that, you know, the positive aspect is what gets killed by the Rh negative aspect. And that in
Mhm.
the occult, it's the gene of Isis, as the generic term, as I talk about in book
Yes.
1, for all the different gens, or the fairy gens or the elven gens is another term they like to use for it from the matriarchal allegory. Um, it is the one that carries the Rh negative gene and passes it on. And so that's why they start new dynasties with a purebred uh, female matched up with a dragon allegory, a
Right.
patriarchal bloodline, but it's especially important for this pure blood. And we get an example of that in the Bible, actually. So Genesis 36, where you have the Horim, which are giants, and we know they're giants, and they're red-haired giants and pale. And I go through the Horim in detail in book 2. And the Dukes of Edom are Horim, and for the most part, and they're going to, Seir is going to have a daughter named Timnah. And Timnah marries Eliphaz, son of Esau, brother of Jacob. And
Right.
this creates the Amalekite hybrids versus the Amalekim giants recorded in Genesis 14. And they're named from sort of eponymously from that tribe. They're going to go live amongst the Amalekim at Petra. And the Malachim have some other locations to them as well, as I document in book 2. But within that, you get this royal bloodline that now has the Abrahamic bloodline in it. And what do they try and do? they try and wipe Israel from the face of the earth when they're
Mhm.
coming out of Egypt. Why? Because then through that new, let's call it a dragon hybrid bloodline, but through the legal aspect of Eliphaz, you would inherit, because there would be no more Israel, you would inherit all of the Abrahamic covenants of the birthright, the blessings, and the Messianic promise.
And it's not the last time they tried to do that. I think it's
No,
interesting that people miss that Hitler wasn't just looking at Jewish people. He was measuring eye teeth. He was checking a lot of
yes.
things that were markers for the Nephilim and the
Yeah,
Nephilim bloodlines.
he would have over time expanded getting rid of inferior peoples, and actually had
Mhm.
already started it. So yeah, they take their Pan-Aryan Volkish ideology back to Tula or Thule,
Mhm.
which is sort of a Norse Atlantis. So it's either a cognate version or a different location, but it sounds like Atlantis, where you had blonde-haired, pale skin, blue-eyed Aryans, Indo-Aryans, and there's 5 sort of groups after the flood, which are the giants after the flood, and that they were trying to backwards engineer theoretically, and they knew if they could, so that if they could do that, they could create new giants, going back to the race that had sort of been diluted and not as ennobled or royale as they would like it. And they were going forward with genetics to sort of dominate what was going to be produced within lands that they that they controlled within those types of genes and physical sort of attributes. So they're creating the new man. They were wanting to
Yes.
create the new Nephilim.
Well, and it makes you wonder what they did, because I know this. I know that they have Henrietta Lacks DNA clear back from 1951 with the HeLa cells. And we know that they can store things. Obviously, they said that can procreate indefinitely on her cellular level. Now we're just talking about
Yep.
cells here.
Yep.
But if we know that they have this kind of information, and talking to Ali Siadatan, he was talking, and I was talking to him about Diana of Ephesus. They figured this stuff out a long time ago. Like, cloning is not this new thing that they figured out. That's a joke. Like,
No.
they've known. Yeah.
Cloning and DNA manipulation was angelic technology from the past,
Yes.
and
Yes.
that um, they need to create an oiketarian moving forward. And if people aren't familiar with that term, it's a Greek word that's used in the New Testament twice. There's lots of derivative words of it, but it's used specifically in 2 Corinthians 5:2 for the house in heaven, and in Jude 1:6 for the habitation that the angels left who committed the sins in the time of Noah. And that specifically means a dwelling place for the spirit.
Right.
And that's very, very important, that the angels left their dwelling place for their spirit and came into the physical world. And you can be a spirit being in the physical world, but if you want to interact physically, and in this case, to reproduce, to pass on your DNA, you have to create a soul and a body, which is part of this world, and the spirit comes from heaven. And
Right.
so they would do that, and they passed on the DNA and the gifts along with it, that including looks, that were their spurious offspring. And that we also need to understand that this counterfeit spirit, this Xerox spirit, is not as the first one was. And plus, you're getting it put into a human body as well. So what they tried to do is create physical gods in the physical world, that, the body wouldn't die, and you'd have this immortal counterfeit spirit. So in Genesis 6:3, that's why God limits life from the physical body aspect to 120 years. So you can't have that. There's a time limit on it. So the only way you can get around that is you have to create clone bodies or a new oiketarian. And for all of these disembodied spirits whose bodies died, who aren't in the pit prison, who aren't, who come out and wander at times from Sheol or heaven on certain holy Sabbath days of the occult, there's 8 of them, and or are roaming the earth as demonic spirits, they need a physical body, an oiketarian, to physically interact. So expect some sort of clone or a chimera type clone being,
Mm-hmm.
to be the oiketerion for these beings in the end time. And chimera comes out of Greek mythology, where you have multiple different kinds of creatures grafted in, so they had DNA capabilities that we're just catching up to. And it starts to make sense of those chimera type of creatures in Revelation 9 with the riders as well, that you would be a chimera probably type creature in a clone, in this creation of this oiketerion that is going to be required for all of these disembodied spirits and those who come out of the pit prison immediately before, and by an extension now have this technology in place for that oiketerion out of the pit prison in Revelation 9. So you have fallen angels and you have the terrible ones coming out. Plus, they'll create bodies for all of these demons that have been in different places since the beginning of the creation of the giants, and the first one loses its body or is killed. And if we want to make sense of the end time and not be caught off guard, we need to sort of understand some of these concepts. So this understanding of the disembodied giants is important. And because it was a counterfeit spirit, their spirit wasn't permitted into heaven, and it's not permitted to sleep. So when humans die, we go to sleep, our soul and body turn to ashes in the earth, and only God and Jesus can separate the soul from the spirit, that the spirit from heaven merges with, and then it goes back to heaven, and it's still in a sleep-like state. So when Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, that means he's bringing the spirit back and reanimating the body. In the Old Testament, where the sorcerer brings back the spirit of Samuel, which Samuel is totally upset. So there's powers to wake up the spirits of humans,
Right.
but they can't recreate the body. They don't have the technology there. And so one presumes Samuel goes back to sleep and back to heaven, but he rebukes Saul, and the
Right.
sorcerer is absolutely in fear because she didn't realize what was going on, and she knows
Yeah.
she's in a lot of trouble. So we need to have this sort of understanding that the part of the invisible ones include these demonic spirits versus the fallen angels who aren't in the abyss. There's a hierarchy there of both the visible ones and the invisible ones. And after that body dies, the demons, they answer to Satan. And we get that shown to us in Jesus' time when he's exorcising these demons from people. But it's a
Right.
bad translation again, unfortunately.
Mm.
And so we're told they're unclean spirits, which is a good translation. We're told that they are evil spirits, which is a good translation. But then we're told they're devils, and they're used interchangeably in these accounts as the same type of entity. Well, that word devil isn't diablos that's used for Satan and devil in Revelation 12. It's daemon, which is the Greek word and the source word for demon. And that's why they're wandering like in dry places. And the only way they can get a place of rest is in an oiketerion or in a house,
Mm.
a home for the spirit. And they're like in dry places, right? So they
Right.
have to, the only way they can interact in a significant way physically is to have that oiketerion. I know that was a long rant. I'm sorry.
No, no. I actually enjoy it. And I think that it's important because some of the things they're doing to our bodies as we go forward into, with AI or
Yeah.
with, transhumanism, or even with certain things that we don't always know what they're doing. When you are
Yep.
talking about, and I don't know how you feel about this, but mRNA, it's concerning to me as a nurse because I know something that it changes certain things in your actual DNA structure.
Yep.
And I'm not saying that cure is the mark. I'm just saying sometimes I wonder what they're doing to possibly prepare a body for an acceptance of that.
Yep.
Maybe it will make it easier. And, we have to look at these things and go, what's really going on? Because it wasn't about a cure.
Yeah.
It didn't work.
Yeah. Well, and
But-
it's all developing the technology to create these oikatarians, and they're not looking in the end to have a human body. They want
Right.
something that would reflect what they had in the past, in
Mhm.
a demigod type status. So size and other capabilities, just as the Rephaim, as you take that back to its Hebrew, you've got several in the lexicon of the Hebrew that show up as names, but they're rooted in one root word. That has two important extensions and then connects into those names. So you have a source word, you have all of these words that sort of derive from it. And the source word is 7495, Rapha as the singular, and Rephaim would be the plural. And that is the word for heal, or
Mhm.
for medicine, or for a doctor, or terms like that. And so what's interesting about that is that the source words coming out of Rapha 7495 is 7496, which is for evil spirit, demon spirit, unclean spirit, right? So it gives you a larger meaning. And 7497 for giants and a tribe of
Mm.
giants. And they all have a meaning. So if you go back to the Ugaritic texts again, the
Yeah.
Rephaim had the ability to heal themselves and to heal others.
Right.
And that's part of the name that they were named after. And so much so that you had to literally take the head off to
Mm.
ensure that that body was going to stay dead, because they had the ability to repair themselves. And so the story I like to relate is the classic example, and I provide more biblically in book 2 from the Bible, is that when Goliath was going up against David selected 5 smooth stones, because there was 5 other giant kings of the 5 city Pentapolis of the Philistines that David thought he might have to kill that day. He didn't think he was going to miss. He had the power of
Right.
God behind him. And he didn't settle for just killing him with that deadly shot to the forehead. And the sling was probably the most accurate, deadly weapon of that time, even though, they have a lot of other powerful weapons, but for accuracy within the range, it was the most lethal weapon. So it would have killed Goliath, but he wanted to make sure he was going to stay dead. So he took Goliath's own sword and chopped his head off.
Mm.
In the execration text, the worst death you can have, that's the Egyptian execration text, when it's talking about hybrids and royals and the Anakim giants and other giants, is to have their heads taken off. Just as in Ezekiel
Mm.
32, these are the ones that are in the pit prison, or the ones who had their heads cut off and went to that pit prison, because it doesn't permit them to go to where they want to go in the afterlife. They probably
Right.
go directly to the pit prison.
Oh, wow. Yeah, this whole thing about the Euphrates River too is kind of alarming. What do you think about that? It's getting kind of low, It's
It
almost
is. It is. And I wouldn't get too excited about that yet. Most people are referring to, as you get into Armageddon battle, you have these 4 angels that are chained at the Euphrates. They're going to ensure that it's dried up so that the armies from the east can come. Well, that's in the last year of the last 7 years. So there's also a lot of dams that are on the Euphrates River today. So, and
Mm.
they may be damming more than what they ought to be. But there is a passage in the Bible that talks about how Euphrates, in conjunction with all the other things that are probably going to cause drought situations with the catastrophes of the last 7 years, and particularly the last 3.5 years, is after the abomination, when you have Judea flee to the wilderness in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and the book of Luke describes this because Antichrist has caused the abomination and they recognize that they've been deceived. They flee to the wilderness to be protected by God for 3.5 years, as Revelation 12 describes this mid-last 7 years event. And there's 3.5 years where they're going to be protected. You have the dragon that's going to, as in the Satan, as he's described in the book of Revelation, is going to spew a river to try and destroy him. And Antichrist is going to be trying to destroy Judah and the Wake and Lost tribes as well in the end time, and likely by fire because of the references that Israel in Exodus is going to be saved from not only this overflowing river, but also they're going to be able to walk through fire in safety as well in this great second Exodus that King David and Jehovah of the Elohim, the word of God, is going to lead as the Jehovah of the Elohim in the end time. And so you have this overflowing river that's causing a scourge on the Exodus that's recorded in Isaiah 43, Isaiah 27, and Isaiah 28. And I think with all of the war that's going on and the sun that's going to bake the earth at that time, that all leads to the drying of the Euphrates at that time. So we're seeing what I would see a birth pang of what's going to be ultimately coming. So that's one of the things I try and do is to ensure Christians don't get too far ahead of end time chronology, because the catastrophes are all the same. So in what I mean by that is the sorrows that get stronger throughout the fig tree generation are earthquakes, are pestilence, are famine, and wars and rumors of war, and or the surging of the sea, if you add in what's talking about in terms of what Luke is describing. And these days of darkness that will, because of these catastrophes, will sort of get stronger. So 25% destruction to open up the last 7 years, sort of circa around the last 7 years in Revelation 6, where 25% of the earth is destroyed and humans.
Right.
And then 33% in the trumpets, and then the wrath bowls would be 100% because they want to destroy this world. And the DNA that they want to create for the Oiketarians, for their disembodied spirits, they're not interested in humans in the new world unless they're going to have them there just for labor or for sacrifice. And what's interesting about that is you match that up with Shiva as the destroyer god, connected to CERN, and that's another rabbit hole. But
Oh yeah,
also the
CERN's a big one.
Abaddon and Apollyon are destroyer gods, and the Shiva doctrine is this: she is a destroyer god, but also a creator god, and it recreates through destruction by fire to create a new world. And that's like the analogy of the phoenix that rises from the ashes, which is the whole evolution of the counterfeit spirit into godhood, that in this new world, they'll have physical bodies that live forever or replacement technology to provide that. And they'll live with their gods and they'll have a realm on their own away from God after the war that they fight. So they don't care whether they destroy the earth, and they don't care that all the humans would be destroyed, because that's what they were created to do when I talk about the giants.
Right. Do you think that the giants that there are some now that are living underground? Do you think that?
I think it's possible, sure. I can't prove it,
Well,
but I
yeah.
would speculate. Yeah. So,
Yeah. That
and
some are, living in like a under earth type of thing,
yeah,
in all these
you
situations.
know, in the earth, somehow, some way, in another
Right.
dimension, could be in the earth, another dimension,
Yeah,
off
could be
the
that.
earth, in stasis, with angelic technology, some sort of sarcophagus type of technology. All is possible. You have that survival of the giant that's described in that Afghanistan
Oh
account.
yeah. The
That's riveting.
Gandar giant.
Yeah.
The Gandar
And
giant.
the
Yeah.
descriptions are how you would describe these, from the smell, size, the quickness, how powerful, how hard to kill. of original giants. So it's either one that
Mm-hmm.
was saved in stasis or in another dimension or
Or popped up.
recreated.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
details are so strong, or it's from such good inside information, it's a terrific
Mm-hmm.
hoax. But the details from the military side and from the giant understanding size is just incredible. And
Right.
we also know within their mythos there are larger than human reptilians in the earth, that's where they dwell.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think those are the giants. They may be part of maybe some surviving giants. Typically, those would be understood as the salamanders of the elemental class, which are taller than humans and reptilian, and also part of the alien mythos was part of the reptilians as well. So I don't think they're, because they're just not big enough to be the giants. Um,
Right.
but maybe they have recreated or um, had a surviving element, so to speak, of elementals
Right.
that rule this world, as they're talked about in the New Testament, um,
It's
from the
like a
Nahash, from the serpent,
modification, maybe. Mm-hmm.
or
Like a
maybe they saved
modification.
some of the serpents before
Right.
they were
Right.
in the earth, off the earth, in the same way that they would have saved some giants if they were able to do that. Or, they recreated all sorts of creatures like little people again after the flood. So maybe
Mm-hmm.
they did the same with the Nahash somehow, some way, or some sort of DNA modification to create these salamanders. But these elementals in the occult are connected to the four elements of the earth, and they're
Mm-hmm.
part of the ruling body. They're part of the hierarchical order of visible ones. And with the visible ones, whirling from Mount Hermon, the Council of Gods, and the seven wandering stars.
Do you think that they've like messed with DNA to recreate like with the orphan trains and these little premature babies at the fairs and this weird stuff? It makes you wonder when you hear about the new, like, oh, this is the new world, and then all of a sudden we've got, if it was not that many kids, I would say, okay, just people died or whatever, but a
Yeah,
250,000 kids popping
yeah,
out of nowhere. I mean, it
yeah.
kind of makes you wonder what they were doing over here. I don't
Yeah,
know.
it's
For
all
me.
part of it. It's all part of the development and reintroduction of the angelic technology that
Mhm.
they're providing us, but we have to learn how to do it. So they're not
Mhm.
just doing it for us. And again, because the fallen angels, they don't get blood on their hands. That's why they created all
Mm-mm.
the various kinds of their offspring to do it for them. The angels are not the ones who slander God. It is the spurious offspring that does that for them
Right.
because they know how powerful God is. And you could look at World War II and the Nazis again as a
Mhm.
really good analogy for this and the complete end time. Um, as with an antichrist figure that introduces a universal religion with the Reichschurch, which is Ariosophy, pan-Aryan Volkish variation of theosophy created by the
Mhm.
Gnostics, to
Yep.
be the religion of Bacon, was announcing that would reunite religion with its home of the seven sciences that I talk about
Mhm.
in book one. Um, and so you have this. Kind of lost my train of thought there. What we were talking about. Sorry.
Oh, about bringing in like the kids to America just as almost like an experiment to see if they
Right, and we're
could, you
talking
know?
about, yeah, we were talking about the
Yeah.
Nazis as the analogy, and so what they
Mhm.
said with all of this knowledge they had, with what they were working on with the new man and genetics, with what they were
Mhm.
working on with a single winged aircraft, what they're working on and developed with rocket engines and jet engines, and with this bell-shaped thing that was thought to be able to go interdimensionally, um,
Mhm.
that knowledge wasn't developed on their own. And they had
No.
no army, no money when Hitler came to power in 1933. But within less than a decade, he had all of this technology being developed.
Yeah.
And they said it came from their spirit guides, aliens,
Mhm.
celestial white mafia, whatever you want to call these entities. They provided them the technology, but they had to do the work to develop it and perfect it.
Well, just like Jack Parsons, I mean, he got the information he got doing some crazy stuff out in the desert. So, I mean, and people want to say that's wild, but look at what he created. I mean, we can talk about, the Babylonian workings and all these different things that were happening there, but they forget he was the proprietor of the
Yeah,
rocket. I mean,
yeah,
like they forget, then where did he get that from? That's it's just back to John D with that channeling
yeah,
that
yeah.
those
And at the
portals.
adept level, they communicate with the invisible ones, and particularly
Yes.
at the higher level ones. And so, yeah, this is all being downloaded in preparation to be like the days of Noah, both before and
Yes.
after the flood, because Noah lived 350 years after the flood as well.
And then I have a weird one for you because I was a Mormon for so long. The things we do in the temple, the first time you go through for yourself, you get baptized for yourself, you do your endowments for yourself, this kind of stuff. It's kind of like Masonic rites.
Yep.
But the next time you go through, and every time after that, you do it for dead people. And
Yep.
it's very necromantic, right?
Yeah.
Like, and
The
and I
ancestors.
Right. I traced it back, and they
Yeah.
will do it even for not just ancestors, but for anyone. They did Hitler's,
Yeah.
they did Anne Frank's, they did
Yep.
Obama's mom. Like, it doesn't matter who, but I traced it back to one thing. I kept coming up with the same thing over and over with Joseph Smith, the Mormons, and the Mason stuff together with just the Masonic Mormons, not
Yep.
all Masons,
Yeah.
was Abraxas. And I wanted to get your feelings on that because it
Well,
would go
and
back to
everything.
that every time.
Yeah, everything in polytheism has a relationship back to the ancestors, and particularly that they're not dead, they're disembodied
Right.
spirits. And you want to make
Mhm.
those connections, and those ancestors are where you fit in the whole hierarchy, in terms of the genealogy and how pure those bloodlines are, and the DNA. So this is an occult ritual. As we talked
Mhm.
about in earlier in the show, our spirits go to sleep as humans. You can't do
Yes.
anything to communicate with them, and anything that you're communicating with is demonic.
Yeah, it's not them.
It's not them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So this is a ritual of polytheism, that people don't know that they're participating in, which is very unfortunate. I know they teach very good
Yeah,
values in the church, and they do
right.
use the Bible, to a certain degree, but it's the other things that sort of go along with it, and the adept level of the church, which
Mhm.
is, so I look more at the adept level as the problem and not the followers,
Yeah,
because they don't
not the
know the
followers.
doctrines,
No.
right? So,
Right, because I have wonderful in-laws and wonderful
yeah,
family that's
yeah,
still in, and they don't know this stuff. They really
yeah.
don't.
And I say
But
the same
there's,
thing about most
yeah.
churches. I mean, it's the leadership, and that goes right
Mhm.
through to the Roman Church. It's not Catholics that are the problem,
No.
it's the leadership, and it's always that way because they control it at the top to lead you away from
Mhm.
God, to reinvent what the Bible says so that you don't really know and listen to their doctrines, not what's in the Bible, but to lead people away from God, to slander God eventually, to
Yes.
dismiss God, and to honor their pantheon of gods. It all heads in that direction, just as the
Mhm.
sciences do.
Yeah, I agree. And what family, in your opinion, at this point in time would be the most, I guess, influential in your opinion? It's only an opinion because I know there's a lot of them, but
Yeah, in terms of an antichrist type figure.
yeah, yep.
Yeah.
And what's going, and it's going to lead into all kinds of things, but I don't want to keep you all day.
Yeah,
But just
there's going to be multiple antichrists, so we need to be prepared for that, and that they keep at least 3 ready to go in Europe all the time, and there's probably antichrist figures around the world from other bloodlines. But within the
mhm,
Western bloodlines, I wouldn't pick one, but you got to keep an eye on the Windsor Hanover, bloodline, and with William more than Charles. Um,
right.
and could you easily adapt the name to I am out of William in terms of creating a mythos there? Not saying that that's going to
Right.
happen, but uh,
It's an
and
interesting. Yeah.
it's a very ennobled unicorn bloodline.
Mhm. I knew about his shield. I knew about his coat of arms and
Yep, yep.
the
And then also the red
unicorn.
dragon
Yeah.
as the Prince of Wales. So it has a
Mhm.
and within that they have a pedigree that they take bloodlines back to Israel. Sion did from King Saul and King David. And allegedly, as we all know through some of their writings and fiction, Jesus and Mary Magdalene, which I absolutely
Right.
dismiss, but
I don't believe
yeah,
this. Yeah.
yeah,
But
exactly,
yeah.
yeah. But anyways, but I would not rule out the Anjou.
Okay. Yeah.
And what's interesting about the Anjou is that the current King of Jerusalem title is held by King Philippe of Spain of the Bourbon.
Okay.
And he inherited it from Juan Carlos, who inherited it from the Habsburg Lorraine dynasty that was passed on through the Lorraine Anjou kings of the Lorraine region, which was, predominantly made up of de Payan, de Bouillon, and Anjou. And there's three branches of Anjou. That was crowned Baldwin the First Anjou of the Knights Templar in 1118 in a small priory on the Rock of Sion.
Yes.
And so that's a strong bloodline. Yeah, and they have an order that is the Knights of the Golden Fleece, which is in Greek mythology the fabric that was knitted into the clothes for the gods and the demigods, so their bodies wouldn't decay, to try and prevent the 120-year lifespan. And Queen Elizabeth had a major chair at the table of the Knights of the Golden Fleece order, run by King Philippe and Juan Carlos before that. So King Charles would have there as well. There's two other rivals that make the claim, and I kind of cover it off in the intrigue of the King of Jerusalem bloodlines. And there's the Anjou of Naples, the Savoy, that make a claim for the King of Jerusalem title, and also the von Habsburg, who believe they have, and it wasn't really transferred over to the Bourbon family through intermarriage, and that they make a claim for that as well. But there are many other families, so it
Yes.
doesn't have to come from those three,
Right.
or
That's
those
just keep your
four.
eyes peeled.
Yeah, so it will, and again, there's going to be one that's going to rise that's going to look like the Antichrist for sure, that
Right.
Antichrist uses to complete his pedigree as the false Messiah, the replacement Christ for Christians in the world. So, and he has to have that in place before Armageddon. So there's a counterfeit Armageddon that he takes credit for.
Okay. All right. Well, that's awesome. I knew I could get some great answers from you because you study so much. And I want anything else you wanted to tell me before I derailed you. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I think I was about there. I mean,
Okay.
yeah, it's one of those things that let's not get ahead of chronology.
Right. Right.
I
It's
think we're in the fig
fascinating.
tree
Yeah.
generation, but we're not into the last 7 years yet. So
Right. Right. Everything seems so sped up and so we talk about this all the time, my husband and I, like the world is much different now than when we were growing up, not just how it feels. It's not
yeah,
about, anything else or the technology or anything. It feels different. It feels faster, just
it is happening
faster.
faster, and
Mhm.
but because those catastrophes are all the same, it's going to seem
Yes.
up, and it's going to lead us astray on what actually is the true year of the Lord's wrath. So, we know a generation can be 40 years as in the time in the wilderness. It can be 70 years as the book of Psalms, or 120 years as Genesis 6:3. It really is, what's the beginning? I think it's, my speculation is with the taking of Jerusalem, uh, along with, as also part of that is the southern kingdom has to be in control of Jerusalem. So 1967 would be, if I was to, and I do speculate on it, that would be the start of it. Then somewhere there, if it's 70 years, I think we're beyond the 40. We're looking in the 2030s. But if it's the 120-year generation, then still lots more things to happen. And before we even get to the last 7 years, we have to have the universal religion. We
Mhm.
have to have the seventh empire, and that has to be in place to provide the ability to have Judah being protected in a peace agreement as part of the larger covenant, and to begin doing the sacrifice again on a wing or an extremity or overspreading of the temple. And that is not going to happen until the Islamic issue is dealt with. And if people think Islam is the universal religion, if they were to take over, they would never permit the Jewish people from doing a sacrifice anywhere near the temple.
Right, right. And I think we're going to see a lot more psyops, Project Bluebeam type stuff. Like
Yep.
they're ramping everything up. And I think those of us that have eyes to see and ears to hear, hopefully see that and just keep our eyes at God, keep our eyes fixed on God and pray. And I mean, really, we just got to arm ourselves with this kind of information.
Yep.
You know, this is wonderful that you've put your time and effort. And I know with these books and the volume of the book, not just the pages, but the information was really difficult. And I appreciate that so much because
Well, I think
this
you're
was a labor for you, I'm sure.
a labor of love. It
Yes.
was so fun
Yes.
to do. So,
Right.
and I think people are going to like it. At least I hope that they like it. And
Yes.
it is totally unique. There is not another book like it on the market. Just as book one was, I think, totally unique and
Yes.
really started conversations that wasn't really talked about in the past. This is just as unique for Christians. And you have no idea, unless you look at my table of contents, how many types of giants there are talked about
Yes.
in the Old Testament.
And the angels too. It's just amazing how you've broken everything down. And it's just wow. I
Yeah.
haven't seen the second one, but like on what I've heard so far, it just sounds amazing. So I can't wait for it to come out. So this is going to be exciting. And if you'll send me everything, I'll put everything in the show notes where they can link to it automatically as well. So, and I would love to have you back anytime. I think this was great and I had a great time with you and I appreciate your time.
Awesome.
So
Thanks.
thank you so much. Have a beautiful day.
You too.